What have I done? Blake's thoughts spiraled, a storm of panic and denial. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on knowing how to manipulate the system to his advantage. But this time was different. He could already see the fallout, his career, his reputation, all of it slipping through his fingers. Should he own up to the mistake, admit he'd gone too far, or should he bury it, just like he'd done with the complaints before? His ego screamed for survival, for control. But a voice in the back of his mind, faint but insistent, whispered of consequences he couldn't outrun. What happens when the lies you built your world on start to crumble? Power. It's a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. It can corrupt, distort, and blind us to what's right. Now, imagine this. A police officer, shielded by his badge, stops a woman on a quiet evening. To him, she's just another face, a target for his unchecked bias. He doesn't know her story. He doesn't know her strength. And he definitely doesn't know she's the wife of his captain, the one man who can destroy everything he's worked to protect. But here's the real question. When the truth comes out, who will be exposed, the corrupt, or the entire system that enabled him? This is not just a story about racism or power. It's a psychological game, a battle of wits, love, and justice. If you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. And that's why you need to watch till the very last second. Before we dive in, ask yourself, do you believe in accountability? In stories that challenge the status quo? Then this is the channel for you. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that's not afraid to dig deep into the truth. Now, let's begin. What happens when power blinds you to consequences? When prejudice ignites a mistake so grave it spirals into chaos? Officer Ethan Blake, a name etched into the streets as both protector and predator. To some, he's a guardian, tough on crime, relentless in his pursuit of justice. To others, he's a shadow of corruption, wielding his badge with a cold indifference born of bias. Ethan's conviction in his own authority has never wavered until tonight. And then there's Simone Carter, poised, composed, her strength unshaken by the battle society has forced her to fight. She's the kind of woman who doesn't just survive but thrives, breaking every mold, shattering every ceiling. A lawyer, a mentor, a voice of reason in a world clamoring with chaos. But even she carries a secret that will bring her face to face with the system she thought she could navigate. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Simone isn't just another face in the crowd. She's the wife of Captain Marcus Carter, the new head of the police department. Marcus, a man whose leadership and integrity have inspired change, whose very presence has turned the tide in a precinct plagued by controversy. Ethan knows Marcus, respects him, but he doesn't know Simone. Not yet. Tonight, two worlds will collide. A veteran officer hardened by his own prejudice and a woman who refuses to bow. An encounter that will unravel reputations, test loyalties, and force everyone involved to confront the demons they've long ignored. Stay with me, because what happens next isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. You think you know how this ends? You don't. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night like a blade, slicing the silence as Officer Ethan Blake eased his cruiser to a stop. Ahead, a sleek black sedan idled, its driver waiting. Inside sat Simone Carter, her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze fixed forward. Blake approached with a swagger born of years behind the badge. To him, this wasn't a conversation. It was a command. He tapped the glass with calculated force. "License and registration," he barked, his tone void of warmth. Simone lowered her window, her movements precise, her expression unreadable. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Blake's eyes narrowed. He didn't like questions. Not from her. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice tinged with irritation. "What's the reason, officer?" she pressed, her tone unshaken. Blake's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, his presence looming. "You questioning me? What happens when someone refuses to bow to unchecked power?" Simone met his gaze, her composure unwavering. "I have the right to ask, don't I?" Her words were a match to dry kindling. Blake's authority felt challenged, his ego stung. Without hesitation, he fabricated the charge. A broken taillight that wasn't broken, a resisting that hadn't occurred. The air grew thick with tension as he placed her under arrest, his voice cutting through her protests. "Enough," he snapped, cuffing her wrists. "You're coming with me." Simone didn't resist. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a declaration of something deeper, something Blake couldn't yet see. As he led her to the cruiser, he glanced at the ID he'd taken from her, and then it hit him like a blow to the chest. Carter. The name stared back at him, plain as day. His pulse quickened. The pieces began to align in his mind, and dread settled over him. This wasn't just a random citizen. This was Captain Marcus Carter's wife. What do you do when the weight of your own actions finally hits you? When the very system you thought you controlled turns its gaze on you? The cold, sterile air of the holding cell wrapped around Simone Carter as she sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Humiliation pressed on her like a weight, anger simmering just beneath the surface. But Simone wasn't broken, far from it. She was thinking, calculating. She had been here before, not physically, but in the stories Marcus had shared, the systemic rot they had discussed late into the night. How do you fight a system designed to silence you? She closed her eyes, the sound of Marcus's voice in her memory. Change doesn't come easy, Simone. You have to push, even when it feels impossible. They had talked about officers like Blake, those who saw their badge as a shield for prejudice. And now, she was part of the very battle they'd strategized to win. But even as she resolved to stand firm, Blake sat in his patrol car, his heart pounding. The name Carter echoed in his mind like a siren. His hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to steady himself. What have I done? Blake's thoughts spiraled, a storm of panic and denial. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on knowing how to manipulate the system to his advantage. But this time was different. He could already see the fallout, his career, his reputation, all of it slipping through his fingers. Should he own up to the mistake, admit he'd gone too far, or should he bury it, just like he'd done with the complaints before? His ego screamed for survival, for control. But a voice in the back of his mind, faint but insistent, whispered of consequences he couldn't outrun. What happens when the lies you've built your world on start to crumble? Meanwhile, across town, Captain Marcus Carter sat in his office, the phone pressed to his ear. The words on the other end hit him like a punch to the gut. Your wife has been arrested. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Anger flared. But it was eclipsed by something deeper, a profound sense of betrayal. Not just to Simone, but to every principle he'd fought to uphold. How do you lead a system that turns against the very people it's meant to protect? Marcus began his investigation immediately. He pulled reports, scanned complaints, and the pattern emerged like a stain on a white shirt, officer after officer covering for Blake's abuses. A culture of silence that had thrived under his watch. Was this the cost of his ambition? As he pieced together the truth, Marcus's conflict deepened. As a captain, he was bound by duty to uphold the law. But as a husband, his loyalty lay with Simone. The two roles pulled at him like opposing tides. When the lines between justice and personal loyalty blur, which path do you choose? And you, watching this unfold, what would you do? Stand silent in the face of injustice or rise to challenge it? The answers you seek might lie in the next chapter, but the choice to act starts here. The room was silent, suffocatingly so, as Captain Marcus Carter stood across the desk from Officer Ethan Blake. The air between them was heavy, crackling with tension. Marcus's eyes bore into Blake, unflinching, unrelenting. Blake shifted in his chair, his confidence evaporating under the weight of the moment. Marcus broke the silence, his voice low but seething. Did you think no one would notice? Or did you think no one would care? Blake flinched, fumbling for words. I didn't know she was your wife. I didn't mean. Marcus's fist came down on the desk, not in anger, but in emphasis, the sound reverberating like a gavel. You didn't mean to get caught. That's all. Blake's mouth opened, then closed. His mind scrambled for a defense, something, anything, to justify his actions. It was just procedure, he stammered. She resisted. I had to act. Marcus leaned in, his voice sharp as a blade. Resisted? Is that what you call it when someone asks a question? Is that what you tell yourself every time you cross the line? Blake's face turned red, anger flaring beneath his fear. I didn't cross any line. She what, Blake? Marcus cut him off, his voice rising. Spoke? Didn't bow to your authority? Tell me, what made her a threat in your eyes? Her words? Her skin? Blake recoiled, the accusation hitting him harder than any blow. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Marcus's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. You've built a career on hiding behind that badge. But not here. Not anymore. You think this is about me? About Simone? He gestured around him. This is about every person you failed. Every life you've disrespected because you thought no one would hold you accountable. Blake's defenses crumbled, his bravado stripped away. He looked down, his hands clenched into fists. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Marcus straightened, his gaze unyielding. It always goes too far when no one stands up to stop it. What happens when you're forced to confront the truth about yourself? When the weight of your choices crashes down and there's nowhere left to hide? Marcus's final words were a quiet, devastating blow. This ends now, Blake. You'll answer for this. Not because she's my wife, but because it's justice. Something you seem to have forgotten. As Blake sat there, the reality sinking in, Marcus turned toward the door. The silence was louder than any words could be. And now I ask you, if you were in Marcus's shoes, would you have the courage to hold someone accountable? Or would you let silence be your accomplice? The story didn't end with Marcus Carter's confrontation. It began there. What started as a moment of personal betrayal grew into something far larger, an unflinching reckoning with a system built to protect itself, no matter the cost. Marcus knew what had to be done. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the reports, the complaints, the undeniable pattern of abuse and silence. Blake wasn't the disease. He was the symptom. And Marcus, torn between loyalty to the badge and his duty to justice, made his choice. That evening, a public forum was called. The room was packed, tension thick in the air. Marcus stood to one side, silent, watchful, as Simone Carter took the stage. She didn't need notes. She didn't need preparation. What she had was the truth, and it was more powerful than any speechwriter's pen. I was pulled over, Simone began, her voice steady but cutting through the room like thunder. Not for breaking the law, but for existing in a way that made someone uncomfortable. That someone was an officer of the law, a man trusted to protect and serve, but who used his power to intimidate and humiliate. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. This isn't just my story, she continued. It's the story of countless others. People who didn't have the privilege of connections or the strength to fight back. People who were silenced. Simone paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. But I'm not here to be silent. I'm here to demand better. From this department, from this community, and from every person who has ever looked the other way. The silence in the room turned into a murmur, then a wave of applause that grew louder, stronger, until it filled every corner. But this wasn't just about applause. It was about change. Behind the scenes, Blake's world crumbled. An internal investigation uncovered what Marcus already knew. A career marked by misconduct, shielded by a culture that allowed it to thrive. Blake was suspended, his badge stripped, his fate now in the hands of those he had failed. What happens when the truth is no longer hidden? When the spotlight turns on those who abuse power? And as the dust began to settle, Marcus stood before his team. This is not the end, he said, his voice firm. This is the beginning. We rebuild, not to save face, but to save lives. This department will no longer protect those who harm. Now, I ask you, watching the story unfold, what will you do when faced with injustice? Will you speak, even when it's difficult? Or will you let silence be your legacy? The choice is yours. Subscribe now, because this story isn't just about them. It's about all of us. The night was quiet, the storm of events settling into a heavy stillness as Marcus and Simone sat together in their living room. The weight of the past weeks hung between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Yet in that silence, there was something else, a bond that had only grown stronger through the fire. Simone broke the quiet, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You can't change the system overnight," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But you've taken the first step." Marcus nodded, his hand finding hers. "With you by my side, I'll take every step it takes," he replied. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the conviction of a man who had seen the worst and chosen to fight for the better. They sat together, united not just as husband and wife, but as partners in a battle that went beyond themselves. The ordeal had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it hadn't broken them. Instead, it had forged a resolve stronger than ever before. And now, as the dust settled, the larger questions remained. How do you hold people accountable while still offering them a chance to change? Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. But where do we draw the line? How do we rebuild trust in a world so scarred by betrayal? This isn't just their fight. It's ours. So, I ask you, what does justice truly look like? The story doesn't end here. It lingers, echoing in the questions it leaves behind. Marcus Carter stood at a crossroads, torn between duty and justice, between the man he was and the leader he needed to be. Simone Carter faced humiliation and anger, but transformed it into a weapon for change. Together, they proved that even in the face of systemic failure, resilience and accountability can spark transformation. But the truth is, this isn't just their story, it's ours. These challenges aren't confined to fiction. They exist in our communities, our systems, our lives. And now, the question turns to you. What would you do in Marcus's position? Would you hold someone like Blake accountable, knowing the cost? Or would you let the silence continue, allowing injustice to persist in the shadows? The system is only as strong as those who demand its integrity. So, how should it deal with people like Blake? Is punishment enough, or is there a path to redemption that doesn't compromise justice? Stories like these aren't just meant to entertain. They're a mirror to the world we live in, a reflection of real challenges and the choices we all face. Let's talk about it. Comment your thoughts. Share your voice. And if you believe conversations like this matter, subscribe. Because these aren't just stories. They're a call to action. Have an amazing 2025.